Good morning, everybody. So the science department is very excited to welcome John Biddle. Now there was a bit of a mix-up, as some of you may have heard, that we thought a different John Biddle was coming. But we are also very excited for this John Biddle. He works in systems biology, but he has a background in physics, and he works at Harvard Medical School. So please put your hands together for John Biddle.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, as can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So as Mr. Friedman was saying, my background was in physics, and now I'm working at the systems biology department at Harvard Medical. And I can say a bit first about what I do on a day-to-day basis and my background, and then talk more generally about my education and career in science and what that's like. And then you all can ask questions, although if you have any questions along the way, feel free to raise your hand. So my original training was in physics. I did a PhD at the University of Maryland, same as the other John Biddle. Actually, the funny thing is I never met him because he was working for the Navy and getting his PhD through Maryland, so he was in San Diego, and every time he would be back on campus, something would come up. It's like our insurance was always getting mixed up and things like that. But anyway, so yeah, I did a PhD in physics at Maryland, and what I studied mostly there was the thermodynamics of phase transitions. And in particular, my topic was on supercooled water. There are some very unusual thermodynamic behavior. If you cool water below the freezing point but maintain it in the liquid state, it starts to act very strangely, and so one of the speculations is that it's near the point of the phase transition. But that was my PhD work, was the physics of phase transitions, thermodynamics, and dynamics. And then I ended up getting a job as a postdoctoral researcher in a biology department. And I'll hopefully explain how that makes sense. So for my current work, what I work on is gene regulation. And what I mean by that is, if you want to think about why gene regulation is necessary, you have you have DNA that's often described as the blueprint for you or the blueprint for whatever organism it's in. And with the exception of the gametes, you have the same DNA in every cell in your body. But you have very different kinds of cells. So you have your eyes, your bones, the cells in your heart, they all have the same DNA. And so that means that something has to be going on in the cell to tell it what kind of cell to be and to tell it which genes to turn on and which genes to turn off. And that's the process of gene regulation. Now, in bacteria, which are the earliest organisms in which people studied gene regulation, it seems to be the case that most of this regulation happens at thermodynamic equilibrium. Bacteria, of course, can't be at equilibrium with their environment. No living thing is, or it would be dead. But they don't necessarily need to expend any energy in order to regulate themselves, in order to regulate their genes. We apparently do, but most of the work up to this point on gene regulation has assumed that we don't. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that systems away from thermodynamic equilibrium are a lot more complicated and difficult to deal with. And so if you can get away with modeling them as though they're at equilibrium, then that's what you're going to do. But there have been some, increasingly this has become inadequate. As we improve our ability to gather data about gene regulation and what goes on in the nucleus of the cell, it's become increasingly clear that we can't use equilibrium models. And so a lot of biology groups have decided that it would make sense to create interdisciplinary groups where physicists who specialize in thermodynamics and dynamics and non-equilibrium thermodynamics would collaborate with biologists and possibly mathematicians to try to explain these things. And that's what I've been doing for the past year and a half since I came up to since I came up to Harvard was actually I was just finishing up my PhD, and the son-in-law of a friend of Mr. Kennedy's dad, who happens to be a friend of mine, said, hey, I saw this talk by a guy, he's doing these really cool applications of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which is your thing. It's up here at Harvard, it's in the biology department, but anyway, I think you should see if he has an opening and apply. And so I did, and that's where I am now. So on a day-to-day basis, what I mostly work on, I analyze experimental data. I don't typically run the experiments. They don't normally let me around living things yet at this point, but I analyze the data, and the question is, can this be explained by an equilibrium model? If that can definitely be ruled out, that opens up a whole bunch of other questions, like where is the energy coming from? If the cell is burning energy in order to accomplish this regulation, where does it get it? And what exactly does it get by burning that energy that it wouldn't be able to get otherwise? And I think the central principle that comes up in this is that if you have a system at thermodynamic equilibrium, then if you watch a movie of that system, so say you were to take like a glass of water that's at thermodynamic equilibrium, and you made a movie of the motion of the molecules in it, and then you played that same movie in reverse, you wouldn't be able to tell whether you were watching the forward or the reverse movie. You wouldn't be able to tell which was which. That's obviously not generally the case in biology. If you were to watch a nature film in reverse, you would know that you were watching it backward. And so that's a manifestation, one of many manifestations of the fact that thermodynamic equilibrium, that biological systems are not at equilibrium with their environment. And we do the same thing on a microscopic level. We'll look at experimental data and see, is there some model that can explain this data reversibly, so that anything that we see, we could just as easily and just as frequently see the reverse? Or is there no explanation? Is there no reversible explanation for this, so that we have to say it must be doing this away from equilibrium and it must be consuming energy to do it? And then we can start to ask the question, where is that energy coming from? So for example, just as an illustration of a recent problem that I've been working on, you have a couple of what are called transcription factors, that they're part of the machinery of turning a gene on or off, is for these proteins called transcription factors to come and bind on the DNA near the gene but not on it. And so near where a gene starts, there will often be this stretch of DNA that has a bunch of sequences that aren't genes themselves, but what they do is they're binding sites. They're binding sites that can hold these factors that turn a gene on or off. And in one of the examples that we're looking at, you have two factors. One from the SOX family, they're called, one from the OCT family. The names aren't important, but there are so many of these that you just have to come up with names for them. And there's some data out that suggests that, so these are, sorry, I should back up. These are both, you can imagine these on the binding site as binding sites on the DNA, and then the actual gene that they're controlling would start here. Well, there's some evidence out that suggests that if you pump more SOX into the system, that also helps OCT to bind, which is not unusual, happens a lot. The funny thing is that if you put more OCT in the system, that seems to push the SOX off. And so we've looked at the question, say we have this, these two sites next to each other, one that binds SOX and one that binds OCT. there are 4 different ways that you might find this. You might find this completely empty, you might find socks, you might find oct, or you might find both. And as you have these little proteins floating around in the nucleus, they'll bind and unbind as you watch a movie of that. What we'd like to do and what we might be able to do eventually is actually just make the movie where we follow both of these and see their dynamics. And what we suspect is happening is that consistently socks binds first. Then once socks is bound, it helps oct to bind. Then socks jumps off, and then the oct comes off. That's what we strongly suspect, that you're going to see it go in this direction a lot more often than the other. If that's the case, it can't be at equilibrium, and it needs some source of energy to drive that. We don't have the means to do that experiment yet, although there's a group back in Maryland that's working on trying to set it up. So what we do instead is we look at data of having different amounts of each of these present in the nucleus of the cell. And then we say, is there some model for the binding that's consistent with equilibrium, with each of these transitions, binding happening just as often as unbinding in every case? We ask the question, is there a model like that can account for what we see, for the way that the binding changes when we pump different levels of socks and oct into the system? It looks like there probably isn't, but these experiments, especially if they weren't originally done for the purposes you're looking at them for, there are often loopholes. You can come up with a lot of different things that can be going on. That's just one example of a problem that I've been working on lately. And more broadly, what I do is, I'll get this experimental data, it'll be published in papers, I'll find it, or someone else in the group will find it, and then the goal is to come up with models that can explain it and see if any of them are consistent with thermodynamic equilibrium. So for what I do on a regular basis, there's a fair amount of computer simulation and calculation, a fair amount of pencil and paper calculation, a lot of reading the published literature, and a lot of sitting around talking with people about possible models and then working them out. So, what I really like about the job is it's challenging and it's intellectually engaging. I have to think pretty hard all day. It keeps me occupied, and it's good. It keeps me out of trouble, I suppose. But really, I like it. I like trying to solve puzzles, and getting paid to try to solve puzzles is fun, and getting paid to try to figure out new things is fun. So I really enjoy that. As far as my workplace in particular, I really enjoy the interdisciplinary aspect of it and how collaborative it is. I've come to a new field, and I get to learn about a new field, and that's a lot of fun. I think when you're doing scientific research, you're trying to produce new knowledge, but consuming knowledge is a lot more fun. Learning is enjoyable, and so I've really gotten a kick out of learning a new field. And just as a side note, biology in particular is a field that's changed a lot in really accessible ways since I was in high school. There have been some really cool things that have happened in physics since I was in high school. But they're not the changes aren't as fundamental, and they're not as accessible. You have to really go to a high level of physics to work on them. But there are some very basic things that are different in biology than when I was first learning it. Because before I took this job, I hadn't taken a biology class since 2000, 2001. And for example, at that time, we were catechized pretty strictly to believe that acquired traits could not be inherited. Have you guys done that in biology class, inheritance of acquired traits and things like that? And Darwin versus Lamarck? Right, so at the time, the belief was that the Lamarckian theory, that an organism, some sort of plant or animal, changes in response to its environment and then passes that on, was a good scientific theory, but it turned out to be wrong. And so it should be buried honorably, but it should definitely be buried. But it's turned out that it's not completely wrong after all. There's a new field that's closely associated with gene regulation, which is what I'm working on right now. A field called epigenetics, which is that although you're not likely to, like say, it's not going to happen that you change your DNA in a way that you pass on to your offspring based on something that happens to you in your life, the patterns of genes being turned off and on actually can be passed on to offspring in some cases. And those can manifest as, you can see the results of that. One of the early, really high-profile studies of this was that people who had survived famines, even their grandchildren, had different metabolic patterns than people who hadn't. And this, obviously couldn't be explained by classical natural selection because these were the people who survived the famine. But, I just say that to give one example of how quickly science and biology in particular changes, and to me that's one of the things that makes it fun and exciting to work in the field and see that. So another thing that I like is, apart from it's a very collegial environment that I get to work in. I came in, I knew a lot of physics and a lot of people in the group didn't. They knew a lot of biology and I didn't. And it was fun and we were eager to share that information with each other and work together. And it's also a very laid-back environment. It's one of the paradoxical things that because it's very focused on a particular goal of research, nobody really worries too much about smaller things. So it's very laid back and supportive. That's especially good for me because I have a 5-month-old son, and so I sometimes, my work hours aren't as regular as they would otherwise be, and nobody really minds that as long as I'm there for meetings. People aren't overly concerned with the hours you work or how you work or how you dress or whatever. And I think that's nice, like I said, especially because it allows me to have it allows me to really prioritize my family, which is increasingly important at this point to me. So I guess, one of the things I was also asked to talk about was my own education path, and maybe in particular how I got into science, but then also how I ended up changing fields. I grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, which is Michigan State University is there. It's right next to the capital, which is Lansing, and which is sort of a very typical. They used to make Oldsmobiles there, but they don't anymore, and so it's one of those Midwestern towns. But there was also the university, and it was a fun place to grow up, and it was a funny sort of environment at the school because with the university resources, if you wanted to get a really good education, you could, but nobody was going to make you. So it was really kind of up to you, and to a certain extent up to your parents. And I was very lucky that my parents valued education and pushed me and made sure that I got one. But I was also very curious. I was the kind of student that I really liked to learn about things. I really liked to understand things. And so I was drawn to physics partly because of that. It seemed like physics was trying to explain things at the most basic level. And I really enjoyed that. I also had a very good physics teacher who would set up independent studies for me and things like that, and coordinate things with the university to get me more into it. And that really drew me further into it and helped me a lot to take that path, I think. And that really worked out for me. But I think, as much as I liked learning and understanding things, I was a good student, but there were a lot of other things that I liked to do too, possibly like to do more, like sports or hanging out at the ice cream shop, things like that, typical. But there were always more fun things going on in school. I certainly never did any projects in the summer or anything like that. I got much more serious about my studies in college, but it's another story. So, Anyway, I studied physics as an undergraduate, and that was when I started to get really serious about it. Right after college, I was a high school teacher for a couple of years. I was part of a program that they would, you could get a master's of education without paying tuition, and in return, you would teach for 2 years at a Catholic high school somewhere that needed teachers. I got sent to Louisiana, which was great. It's a really fun place. If you ever get a chance, South Louisiana is a fantastic place, but don't go in July. It's especially a good place to be a teacher because you're there in the winter. It's a fantastic place, ton of fun. But after that, I decided I wanted to learn some more. So I went back to get a PhD in physics. And then, like I said, I was looking around, toward the end of my PhD in physics, I was looking around at these, looking around for jobs, as you have to do eventually. And a lot of the new applications of physics are in biology. And that's something that's been realized by both physicists and biologists, is that I think a lot of the growth in biology comes from the improvements that have been made in research techniques, or in experimental techniques. We can do a lot that we couldn't do 20 years ago. For example, you can track an individual protein within a cell now. You can make a movie of it so that you can always see where it is. 35 years ago, there was absolutely nothing like that. And those advances keep coming out. They recently sequenced the human genome. That, when I was in high school, that was going on. Now it's completed. And so the more of this data that people have, the more that it's understood, that the more of this, it's the kind of data that can really be analyzed well by physics. And so that both that creates these kinds of collaborations between biologists and physicists. And so I was looking at quite a few of these jobs in biology, or in biophysics as it's called, that were advertising for physicists. And it looked like a lot of fun to me because as part of graduate school I'd been teaching a physics for the life science course, and I realized a lot of the physics, there's a lot of cool physics going on in biological systems, but it's not necessarily the physics that usually gets taught in introductory courses. And so being part of that definitely opened me up to the possibility of studying biology. And so then I did, I took the job here at Harvard, and it's been great. Like I said, I enjoy it very much. It's a very good job. I guess, a couple of pieces of advice. It was suggested that I give you all some advice about college and career and things like that. So if I were to give you one piece of advice about college, it would be to make the most of your professors. Because, first of all, it's their job. You're there, basically, you have the privilege, which you may be paying for, of being around people who know a ton about their field. And so really make the most of it. Go to office hours, talk to them after class, ask for help with your homework when there are things you don't understand. Because not only is it their job, but they love doing it. College professors love talking about the things that they study. And they love imparting knowledge, sharing information, things like that. They'll be very happy to talk to you to work on these things. And they're really just, they're human beings. They're very approachable. Like I said, they love it. So make the most of it. Don't just sit through class and do your homework, but really engage with your professors while you're there. I think, going back even to sort of ancient philosophy, the idea has been that the best education happens when there's a sort of friendship between the people involved. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're, drinking buddies or whatever, but when you actually have something of a relationship with the person and come to know them and understand where they're coming from, that really helps. That's the best way for education to happen. I encourage you to make the most of that opportunity. But, they are people, so you don't always have to believe everything that they say either. Make sure, be willing to challenge them and engage them and think for yourself and consider a variety of perspectives. And if I were to give you one other piece of advice, it would be don't necessarily, especially I think this is something that scientists fall into. Don't define yourself by your career choice or your course of studies. There are lucky people who find their work enjoyable and satisfying, and I'm one of those people, and it's great, and it really makes your life better. But I don't know that I've ever met anybody for whom their career in science is the most important thing in their life, and they're also a happy person. So, even if you succeed at making a career out of it, it's probably not going to bring you fulfillment and happiness in any sort of deep or all-encompassing sense. And I think that, and the other thing is that, especially academic careers in science, I still might not end up having one. They're difficult. I'm still in a postdoctoral position. It's not a permanent job. We'll see if something works out for me later on, but it might not. And there are a lot of reasons to go do something else instead. And, PhD programs are just notorious for people being depressed and having nervous breakdowns and things like that. And I think one of the causes of that is that people come to really identify themselves as an academic scientist more than anything else. And then when maybe it becomes uncertain that they'll be able to follow that career path. Maybe it becomes clear that for family reasons, health reasons, whatever, they shouldn't. And that can be a really difficult adjustment that a lot of people have to make. So you can save yourself some time by not thinking of yourself primarily that way in the first place. Don't get me wrong, I love what I do, and I wouldn't, now that I'm too old for a professional football player to be a reasonable career path, there's nothing else that I'd rather do, but also too small. But it's, I wouldn't make it the number one thing in your life. So that's about all that I have as prepared remarks, but do you guys have any questions? Yeah. The question, how much biology did I study in college? None. I took a high school biology course, and that was all the biology that I had, but I studied enough biology to teach physics for life sciences, and that was it in graduate school. But the funny thing is that once you get a degree or a PhD in something, people have sort of decided, well, you know how to learn stuff, and so they'll take a chance on you. Yeah?
What kind of job were you?
You mean after undergrad? Well, I guess I was thinking that I would probably go to graduate school because I was encouraged to do so. I did teach for a couple of years. I thought it was possible that I would stick with that long term. Also possible that I would go back to some graduate school and then become a high school teacher permanently, just depending on how all of those things worked out. I figured, though, it would be something in teaching or research or something like that. Yeah. I went to Notre Dame for undergrad. Yeah.
Is there any other sector of science you're interested in?
Any other sector of science I'm interested in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I find almost all of it interesting. I still think that other subfields of physics are very interesting. In particular, I never do quantum mechanics in my job, ever. And that's almost too bad because I learned, I spent a lot of time studying it, and it's really cool. I just don't do systems that are small enough for it to be relevant, but I still think quantum mechanics is very cool. And I guess the other area that would be a hobby for me, but probably won't ever get paid to do, is philosophy of science. Fascinates me. Anything else? Yeah. There's one more question, I think. Yeah.
How easy is it to get a job?
If you have a degree in, it depends on the field. If you have a degree in physics, it probably won't be hard to find a job. It is very difficult to find permanent academic jobs. It's harder and harder to find jobs if you want to be like a research professor, if that's your goal. But there are lots of things that you can do with a degree in physics or biology that aren't that, and those jobs are always very available. And like, as happened with me, you can even go work in a different field. So it won't be hard to find work. It might be hard to find the work that you really want. Yeah?
How long did it take you to
Yeah, it took 6 years, and I definitely thought about quitting sometimes. Because it's hard, it's a lot of work, it's long hours, and you kind of feel like your life is on hold. The stipend is plenty, but you can't raise a family on it. And so, sometimes I thought that I would, I seriously considered it at some points stopping the PhD program and going back to teaching high school, which probably would have been fine too, but at this point things have worked out well, so I'm glad I stuck with it. Yeah? I was mostly looking at jobs that were also research jobs. And by the time I graduated, I was largely looking at biology because biology was hiring so much more than physics at that. Biology was probably hiring more physicists than physics was at that point. Yeah? I was able to, there was pretty much no overlap. I was looking for jobs during the last year of my PhD. And so I had already accepted the job before I defended my dissertation with the understanding that I would come up and start once I finished. Yeah?
How do you find the environment of your job
The environment of the job? Well, I think one difference is Harvard has a lot more money than the University of Maryland. And so the coffee and tea are better, the air conditioning and heating work consistently, and I don't have to drive myself and pay for my own gas if I want to go to a conference. So those are really nice. But more generally, it's now that I'm working in an interdisciplinary group that's run by a mathematician, and I'm no longer a student. And so I have there's a lot more collaboration within the group, and I have a lot more freedom and independence in what I do. When I was a student, the tasks were when I was a graduate student, even working on my dissertation, the tasks were much more set by my advisor. Now my advisor and I will work together on picking a problem, and I'll check in with him every week or so. But really it's up to me for the most part to figure out how to solve it. And I travel myself to try to work out collaborations with other groups. So that's a big thing. It's a great deal more independence. And I worked much longer hours as a graduate student than I do now. And if I did want to continue to work very long hours, my boss wouldn't complain, but now that I have a family, it's nice to be able to just work from, say, 9 to 6 and then go home. Anything else?
Let's give our speaker a hand. We have kind of an awkward amount of time, but if you guys have 15 minutes left, we're going to send you back to your rooms, class 3.